We have 3 talks in our first session on psychopathy. The first by Kent Gill with the University of New Mexico and the Mind Research Network. The first title he gave me was Psychopathy, the Truth, but the longer one is Psychopathy, Clinical and Forensic Relevance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's always lovely to talk about psychopaths right after you've eaten. So let's see how this goes. So the first thing is just to orient everyone to what we mean when we're talking about this condition or what we want to study. And so most of you, when you try to picture something like this, you might actually picture someone like that. For example, that's a favorite that individuals like to. Oh, can you see? You can barely see him. That's Anthony Hopkins portraying Hannibal. Or then you might be able to dim the lights a little bit. Always good for a lecture on psychopaths to have a dimmer lecture. And then you might remember this one. This is a very popular one if you do this type of lecture to undergraduates. Everyone believes Dexter's a psychopath. Turns out we scored him in my lab. He scores pretty low, actually. He's far too controlled. And then you have this one, which is my motivation, and most of you will probably recognize this face. That's just to try to get us oriented for some laughter, but let's move on to really the symptoms of psychopathy. So over the last kind of 200 years of psychiatry, psychology, the symptoms of psychopathy have been kind of debated and corralled, etc., back and forth, and these are the 20 that are currently constitute what's known as the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. Hare, based on Robert Hare's work, my former graduate school mentor, and there are 20 of them that we now currently assess when we're trying to quantify this condition or define this condition. And there are things like a lack of empathy, guilt, remorse, a profound failure to plan. They don't have very realistic long-term plans, for example. They're very fiscally irresponsible. I know now you're thinking of all of your spouses and other types of people, but please stop that. A chronic need for stimulation, a parasitic orientation, impulsivity, sexually promiscuous, and so on. And these traits start from a very early age. They're often a child who scores high on the early behavioral problems is a child taken from the home by social services, even though the parents are taking care of other kids normally, so a very disproportionate kind of response to their environment. It persists through severe adolescent delinquency, and then on and into a wide variety of different types of criminal behavior. Now, just want to comment on 2 things about this, how you assess this. It's based on lifetime functioning, and so you have to have these types of traits in most areas of your lives, have to be present in all the different interactions in your lives, and for a long period of time. And so they're not very relative to change. So it's hard to change these types of symptoms or to change your score on this test the way this is done. And it's not a pen and paper test, so I'm not going to hand Nick a self-report instrument and have us find out how manipulative and conning and everything he is, especially with respect to the timing on this talk. And so it's an interview-based measure. So we basically going to spend 2 to 6 hours sometimes with an offender, and then we're going to review all of the collateral information and then score these items. Each of the items is scored on a 0, 1, or 2-point scale, 2 the highest, 1 intermediate, 0 none, and so the scores range from 0 to 40. And just for psychometric purposes, we define someone who scores about 30 or higher as meeting the criterion and having this label or this diagnosis or this condition or scoring very high, however you want to refer to them, as an individual who scores high in psychopathy or is a psychopath. And that's the real kind of the difficulty, the cost. It's expensive. It's time-consuming to do this kind of assessment. But so if it is so difficult and time-consuming, well, then what's its forensic relevance? Is it worth actually doing this kind of assessment? And so I'll try to raise with you why we think it's important and helpful. One of the things I wanted to emphasize, which I've started to do more recently, is that most of the people in this room have asked individuals, as if it's a choice, do you feel remorse for what you've done? How many of the judges have asked a defendant, after convicting them, okay, you don't have to raise your hand. Federal judges never like to raise their hands. State judges prefer usually to raise their hands. Morris is sitting there very quietly asking me not to pick on him. So they'll ask this question, often, to a defendant, do you feel guilt or remorse for what you've done? And the psychopath often sits there like he's looking at this equation. Okay? Like if I asked you to solve Einstein's equation here, most of you get a blank mind, a blank slate, so to speak. You just, okay, I look at Owen. Owen's like, yeah, no. So that's the point, is that when we study individual psychopathy, that's how they kind of appreciate or understand empathy, guilt, and remorse, is that it just does not come to pass. So the question is why and how, and is it really a deficit? And how would we come to understand that, and how would we come to remediate that? And that's the segue into Mike Caldwell's program later. So these symptoms that we assess, why are they relevant for forensic systems? So just to kind of give you a quick overview, If we look at, this is what's called a survival curve. So we have here a number of offenders, and we're going to release them back into the community. And this is individuals who've scored high on psychopathy in green. This is the yellow, which is the middle average inmate, roughly. And this is an individual who scores low on psychopathy. And what you find is that the rate and severity and the total number of individuals or psychopathy is a predictive of both the rate, how fast you go back and get in trouble, and also the likelihood that you're going to get in trouble, and this is over a 1-year period. So what this means is that following release, this group of offenders, 50% of them have been reconvicted of a new crime within 180 days of being released. So that's a potent thing. How can you predict behavior? How potent is it for actually helping us understand that? That's a pretty important thing to kind of understand. And psychopathy is considered, and there's hundreds of studies out there right now looking at how good it is, and they vary across. But in general, the consensus is that it's a pretty good predictor of recidivism. And so it's something that if you're going to try to reduce recidivism, you would want to treat or remediate. It's a risk factor for people getting in trouble again and again. And in particular, it comes out that psychopathy is a particularly potent predictor of violent recidivism. And so this is actually the largest study that I'm aware of, several hundred offenders that were done. They were all violent offenders. And what they looked at is over a 20-year period, 25-year period, and all this work is done in Canada because they have a nationwide offender tracking system. Psychopathy, in terms of reconviction for violent offenses, is a potent predictor of the rate and the total number of those individuals going to recidivate. And the bad news from this study is that nearly the majority of the sample had recidivated violently after such a long period of time. And Canada is where most of this work tends to come from because, again, they have this very efficient, very good nationwide offender tracking system, and they make it widely available to researchers who openly access and do work on this. So these are official kind of criminal statistics. Psychopathy is also potentially one of the things you want to really consider if you're designing a treatment program. And so this is a study, again, showing that individuals with psychopathy who are untreated have a higher probability of reoffending violently than individuals who don't have psychopathy in this study. And what they found is, and I'm not going to go into any details for time constraints, but some treatment programs can make a huge dent in recidivism, 50% reduction in violent crime in the individuals without psychopathy who are treated in this program. And in this study, what they found was that they've aggravated individuals with psychopathy. That is, they've elevated their risk. Now, there are some issues with this study. Again, I can't go into all the details, but there have been this is a study in Canada, and it's been replicated in the UK and Australia that certain forms of group therapy may be contraindicated for individuals with psychopathy. So you wouldn't want to put people in this type of, and what I always like to wonder in an audience like this, well, what kind of role do we have as a society to play if we're putting offenders in these programs that when we're not classifying the offenders as those that are going to do well or do bad in this program, we're aggravating them. We're potentially causing more criminal behavior to come about by putting them in treatment programs that are not identified well for their the symptoms and the problems that they bring to the table. Other work has shown that kids or youth that have these types of traits, and again, I won't go into too much detail, but similarly, individuals or kids who have these emerging traits are also higher risk to actually reoffend violently following release. And so these traits are present from a very early age. They're harder to assess the younger you go, and the question is, how do you go about remediating those traits? How do you go about understanding those traits and treating those traits? So the talk that my lab is largely focused is looking at how does the development of this green area, now most of you are not neuroanatomists, so I'm not going to go into all the details of these areas, but we're interested in understanding these limbic regions here, these different areas, and how they develop, and if they develop along a different trajectory in individuals with this symptomology. And that's largely the hypothesis that we're testing. Now, these circuits are associated with emotional, cognitive control, a lot of different types of executive processes, and et cetera. And one of the things that we found, to give you kind of a legal relevance, one of the behavioral things we found, some of you might be familiar with the construct of emotional intelligence. There's certainly everyone in the room is familiar with intelligence and is familiar with the Atkins decision, which eliminated the death penalty for individuals with low IQ in the United States. But here we find that individuals with psychopathy, after you control for general intelligence, because psychopaths usually score very high or normal or above average on measures of intelligence, that they're impaired, that they show a reduction relative to the low scores, and relative to undergraduates, they're all impaired. The average inmate is impaired. But in certain aspects of global, experiential, and what you call strategic emotional intelligence, and this is an abilities-based measure called the Mesquite, psychopaths are impaired. So the question would be, would you want to make a legal argument that individuals who score, so let's say 2 standard deviations below the mean on emotional intelligence, would you make an Atkins kind of argument, based on that kind of a case, that individuals who have this deficit, should be spared from the death penalty? And so, according to the attorney who argued Atkins, who's at the University of New Mexico Law School, he said yes, he thinks that this is a logical argument, and that it would be one that might be made someday in court. And so that's some of the more recent work out of our lab. But the real neuroscience, so what most people are interested in looking at, is this type of stuff. And again, some of these images aren't translating very well with this projector. I apologize for that. This is the famous case of Phineas Gage. Probably everyone in the room has heard the case of Phineas Gage. He had this unfortunate accident in which this iron rod blasted up through his head. This just shows the trajectory that that rod took. And if I show you here, kind of on the image here that I refer to as this paralimbic circuit, what we find is that the rod transected the orbital frontal and the anterior cingulate cortex. It also damaged some deeper inner structures as well. And after this, why this is interesting is that Gage was no longer Gage. He became impulsive, garrulous, hot-headed, got himself in trouble occasionally, and nomadic, and he moved from place to place. He became a circus act, essentially. And so people often now refer to this condition as acquired sociopathic or psychopathic personality, that is selective, significant damage. It has to be bilateral. It can be to either both sides of the anterior cingulate or both sides of orbital frontal cortex, will lead to this impulsive, disinhibited kind of syndrome that is consistent. Some of the symptoms are consistent with what we study. And from that, you can infer that, hey, these regions of the brain are likely, more likely than not, involved with these types of symptoms because damage to them leads to these types of behaviors. So it makes sense then that you can go the other way, which is that individuals who have these behaviors might have something different about them in terms of the function of these circuits. Most of you are probably familiar with fMRI. I'm not going to belabor this. It's a complex process. Some people before me have talked about it, and I mean, I teach a whole course, 16 weeks on just this slide, and so to try to present that to you in 12 minutes or whatever I have left is not really possible. But fMRI is a complicated technique, and it's really critical that you think about all the strengths and weaknesses before you consider what these beautiful images actually kind of create and mean. So in my lab, one of the things that's, if you want to study psychopathy and you want to study them in large numbers to try to help make some sort of informed decisions about how to treat them, how to manage them, how to help understand them, etc., you have to, for years we used to transport inmates from prison to the hospital, and we would do maybe 5 or 10 a year. Well, you're not going to make a career in 5 or 10 subjects a year or necessarily make a dent. And so one of the reasons I left Connecticut or left Yale was to move to New Mexico because they bought me a trailer. Yes, I live in New Mexico and I have a trailer. But it's a very, very nice trailer. And it has in it a mobile one. It's the only scanner that's been set up. It's the most advanced scanner that's ever been put in a truck like this. And we've deployed it at different institutions around the state and now in Wisconsin and soon a few other states where we're trying to collect large numbers of inmates to try to help study this condition in large numbers, as well as other issues like PTSD and trauma histories, as well as all the kind of vexing issues that come up in substance abuse. And to date, just yesterday, we passed 1,700 offenders who volunteered that we've scanned, but this includes adult men, women, juveniles, male, female. Really? 3 minutes. Okay. And we recently finished a study of 150 sexual violent persons that were convicted. Okay, 3 minutes. Briefly, what we've looked at is two kind of things. One is what's called gray matter density analysis. This measures and looks at the structure of the brain in terms of its density. So if you think of it like a muscle, you work out your muscle, it's going to get big and strong, etc. One way to think about this is that this area hasn't worked out, but the blue areas that are shown here are showing a deficit with respect to psychopathy. So the higher you score in psychopathy, the less dense is this tissue, in a sense, in this analysis. Now the big question is, well, how did it get that way? If you have a dense or a deficit, in your arm, for example, or you've been tied to your chest for months and months, and it atrophies, your muscle atrophies, the physician's going to look at you and go, well, that's because of non-use. Or another physician might look at you and go, is that a genetic abnormality, or what is that wrong? You can't necessarily infer that from these data. So the causal link is not necessarily there yet, but the idea there is that there are these very substantial differences. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip to some of the latest and greatest kind of work that's come out of the lab. I'm going to switch to a different PowerPoint. Excuse me, I know I'm using up my valuable time. And this is the latest and greatest kind of research that's come out of the collaboration in the MacArthur Project, Law and Neuroscience Project, which I was privileged to participate in. And let's see how it shows up. Good. So this is in the 2 minutes we have left, or the minute and a half we have left, I'll just run through this. So if you put you in an MRI scanner and we scan to scan, so this is just time going down this way, okay? What we find is that there's what's called spontaneous bold fluctuations. That is, your brain is generally just oscillating. And if you look at the time series, you can see that there's just kind of this oscillation. And it turns out that on average, if you try to look and extract the circuits in the brain that are doing oscillations in kind of concert, if you will. So there's this kind of map, and there's this map, and there's these different networks in the brain that are basically oscillating in unison or synchrony. And what you can do is you can ask, well, let's look at something called functional connectivity. So not instead of just looking at where in the brain things are happening, but how is the brain kind of interconnected? And you can go through this very complicated process and iterate through and ask where are all the different regions of the brain connected, all these different networks connected. And what you end up with is a very complicated map that looks like this. So this is in a group of 105 adult offenders stratified by psychopathy. And the higher you score in psychopathy, this is the disordered connections that occur that are related to psychopathy. And this is dramatic. In fact, this group at Washington University has said that this is more different than any other condition they've ever studied. Schizophrenia, bipolar illness, depression, PTSD, they don't have nearly the same number and disordered connections. And the other thing the reason why I'm showing this is that because what we found, and as a segue into Mike Caldwell's group, is that looking at 110 kids on the same, that are in maximum security, so they've all been convicted of violent offenses, we find that and there's really not time to go into all the details of this. We find that kids are showing some patterns, but it's not nearly as, this is a 35-year-old offender on average, and this is a 15-year-old on average. And so the connections are still not necessarily disturbed. And there's a lot of issues associated with this with respect to how we assess psychopathy. But the point is that we believe that there's far less determined connections in youth, and this is consistent with tons of other literature, than there are in the adult. So I'm interested actually in trying to help fix these connections as well as these connections. And with that, I think that the last thing, just to note, is that what we found, and there's a variety of different ways that we've looked at this, is how good are we at predicting kind of the individual kind of maps. And so using these validation kind of techniques and these machine learning techniques, we can kind of get between plus or minus 3 points, 2 points on the psychopathy scale based on these patterns of connections. Okay, so using these leave one out kind of procedures. And so this work is looking at the impulsivity aspect of psychopathy, and we have other work that's looking at the affective aspect of psychopathy. And so this means that I would say within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have measures of brain connectivity, brain connectedness, that tells you and fits you on that trajectory of psychopathy, those scores of psychopathy, within a couple points, which is the standard error of measurement of the test. That is, if I assessed all of you right now and I had 10 other people assess you, there'd be a standard error of measurement. And so the brain imaging is mapping on extremely well to that test. That's the diagnosis. This is the brain data is just being related to it. And so being a good psychopath researcher, I should take credit for everything that I've just said, but I will not do that, and instead I will try to get my other slide up here while I'm entertaining questions about that extremely quick presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions?
Well, you have time to tell us something about the anatomy of that connectivity that you're showing. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so that anatomy, the anatomy of that connectivity is very complex, and so it's I'm afraid that it's extremely complex. And so we were hypothesizing that it would be largely paralimbic circuits that would be disconnected, but that analysis showed that it was far more widespread, that parietal decision-making areas are not disconnected or hyperconnected to other areas of the brain. So actually trying to digest that thing was almost like 50 pages long in terms of things that they found. Like I said, that it was a large sample, several hundred offenders that went into that, but actually trying to quantify exactly what it means, that's actually going to take some time for us to figure out exactly what we think it means in terms of development.
Yeah, I've got lots of questions, but just one for the sake of time. You start off by those pictures of those horrific fictional psychopaths, people who will kill you at each liver and so on. I wonder if you think that in some ways. Sorry, I wonder if you think that in some ways is slightly misleading about the population of persons that you're looking at. It maybe doesn't do those people any great service to associate that large population with these rather horrific and very, very rare individuals who always come to mind when the word the very problematic historical word psychopath is used?
Yeah, so normally when I give those are there to draw your attention, and then by the end of the talk, of a normal hour and a half talk, I've changed your mind from that being the person, what I was drawing your attention to the fact that it's far more banal, far more common, and it's usually not necessarily anything like those individuals. But today I left that slide in there just to try to grab your attention after lunch and the lull. So it's nice to see that you were paying attention. I appreciate that. Yes?
I was just wondering whether, particularly for the juveniles, whether you've had the opportunity to look at siblings of them who've not been offenders to see whether there's this theory that, you're born with a certain cortical density and thickness that leaves a vulnerability to, say, if you are abused or there are other sort of circumstantial evidence, then you might be more vulnerable to get on that trajectory. So
sure.
Are you looking at siblings?
Don't have a funded study looking at siblings. Certainly there are other siblings that come, that we can scan siblings. More likely than not, after the 5 or 10 years of doing this work, we've found that there's quite a few children whose parents are incarcerated that we've also volunteered for research. In fact, we've had parents who are incarcerated have consent to have their children who are incarcerated scanned. And so that's probably something that we may be able to talk a little bit more about. But unfortunately, most of the individuals who score high on psychopathy have no idea where their family and kids and everything are. So this is types of practical limitations. It's very difficult to do that kind of work.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.